Okay, hello, welcome back. So, here we go, last chunk. Alright, it should be about 20 minutes and then you are done. So, how did you do with the mini task? So, you should have thought back to the task at the end of part 1 about your happy day. You should have identified whether aspects of your happy day were reflected in Riff's well-being. Then there was a second one about, which isn't on here, so I've made a mistake, but that second one was kind of saying, if you'd have kind of measured your well-being according to Riff's facets, would you have had high psychological well-being? Did you have all those 6 things? And then the other thing to do was to look back over all those concepts that we learned about and see if any of them really kind of spoke to you and really fitted in with your happy day. So hopefully that's given you a chance to look back at not only the psychological well-being slide and the definitions of the facets, but all the other concepts. So what did you experience during your happy day? Perhaps it was positive relationships with others, or maybe it was self-acceptance and feeling good about yourself. Or maybe there were other concepts that were a better fit for you on that day. For example, I find that self-determination theory, with its 3 little things of autonomy, competence and relatedness, really kind of fits with the days when I have good days, when I have days where I think, that's a good well-being day for me. On my best days, I tend to have met all of those, the autonomy, the competence and the relatedness. So that's one that really kind of speaks to me and fits in with how I conceptualise well-being. So, we were talking about the fact that, it's possible that while reflecting on your own happy day and looking more closely at the different conceptualisations, you might have noticed something. You might have noticed that all those concepts that were trying to embrace eudaimonia and trying to address issues with subject well-being were actually quite different, but also had some weird similarities. Okay? In other words, there was no kind of clear eudaimonic concept. The concepts of well-being that were trying to address eudaimonia differed in some very significant ways, but also had some things that were the same. So there wasn't really any clarity. Also, you might have noticed that quite a few of them included positive emotions, which was the limitation of hedonic well-being that they were trying to address in the first place. In other words, this introduces quite a clear overlap between those hedonic and eudaimonic schools of thought that the ancient Greeks had. In other words, a lot of positive psychologists will talk about hedonia and eudaimonia and hedonic and eudaimonic well-being as if they're completely separate. But actually, there's quite a lot of overlap, and it's not just with positive affect. Another way to look at this issue of the overlap is that eudaimonia is often defined as well-being that is more than just feelings. But positive feelings were included in some of these concepts, or were considered to be an outcome or reflection of high well-being. So you can't really say, we've created this concept to address the fact that subjective well-being was really focused on hedonia and positive feelings, if positive feelings are also in your concept. Either they're important or they're not. There's also a little bit of snobbery. There's a kind of implication that well-being based on positive feelings or hedonic well-being isn't meaningful or worthy. Okay, so it's kind of suggested that eudaimonia might be better than hedonia. Now remember, these eudaimonic concepts were devised in response to the perceived limitations in subjective well-being. But I want you to look back and check and look at the fact that subjective well-being is the balance of positive and negative feelings and life satisfaction judgments. That's all it is. It doesn't ask about the source or where they come from. Eudaimonic researchers have assumed that these positive feelings are coming from, perhaps activities that aren't meaningful or purposeful or authentic. But they don't know that. It might be that they are coming from the exact kind of activities that they're suggesting people should be doing in their eudaimonic concepts. And those kind of things can also be used and brought to mind when people assess their own life satisfaction and cognitively evaluate their own life. So, what we're saying here is that this distinction that the ancient Greeks seem to say was so clear, and that positive psychologists have argued is a justification for kind of all these different measures, and that subjective well-being doesn't cover eudaimonia enough. Actually, there's probably such a huge amount of overlap, and they aren't so distinct, and things that look hedonic at first glance may well be eudaimonic if you just ask a few extra questions. So, one of the reasons that people might get a little bit judgmental and make assumptions about subjective well-being, in other words, subjective well-being, the one that is life satisfaction and positive and negative feelings together, remember, it often gets referred to as happiness. So one problem that keeps cropping up is that happiness and well-being are kind of intuitively synonymous. They seem to mean the same thing in everyday language and common sense. You'll see this a lot in media reports of studies that examine well-being. They basically just use happiness as a shortcut in the media. They say happiness rather than explain well-being is complicated and can be defined in lots of different ways. Yeah, they don't bother. They just use happiness, but you know better. So you'll see this a lot in the media, and you may also see it in some published research. Researchers might be unclear as to what they mean when they say happiness or well-being, and they may often use the same term, and you would have to go and look in their method section to find out exactly what conceptualization or definition or measurement they used. The problem is also that, much like well-being, happiness means different things to different people. Okay, happiness tends to mean joy and positive feelings, and we've already seen that joy and positive feelings are consistently part of the conceptualizations of well-being. But, like with well-being, some people might argue that happiness is more than joy, and more than positive feelings. So when talking about happiness, we end up in a very similar place to when we talk about well-being. And that might be kind of part of the problem as to why they're kind of seen as the same thing. But if we look at these examples of kind of adverts, happiness is also used as something that you should pursue and you should get and you should obtain, and it's quite easy. And that idea of happiness is very much in line with the hedonic idea that the ancient Greeks had, and that gets mentioned a lot in positive psychology, but is very at odds with the eudaimonic concepts of well-being. So, we're going to go back into a kind of bit of a history lesson, actually, because this is quite a nice example as to what happiness is or isn't. So, what did the founding fathers think? Okay, here we have possibly the most famous reference to happiness. This is the American Constitution, which they wrote when they declared independence. Okay, when they regarded themselves as an independent state and no longer part of the British Empire. Okay, so it goes, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. It's almost like being in Hamilton now. I don't know if you're a Hamilton fan. Anyway. Blah blah blah, certain unalienable rights, And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, in other words, it's not your right to have it or experience it, but your right to pursue it. Okay, but problem. What did they have in mind when they wrote this? Let's have a look. It's our old friend Bradburn. Happiness at the time of the American Revolution was not about personal feelings of happiness or joy or positive emotions. In 1776, sorry, that's me doing Hamilton again. In 1776, happiness was more about prosperity, thriving, and general well-being. Okay, and it was potentially also meant in a more political sense. In other words, this happiness that they're talking about is about having your individual rights. Okay, it's not about being a happy, joyful person and having the right to be happy and finding that happiness. It's not about that. So, what we can see from this example is that the definition of happiness has changed according to the historical context and the culture at the time. And the idea that happiness is about joy and positive emotions that are of an individual is relatively modern. So we've got a lot of thoughts in our heads now, haven't we? It's getting quite complicated. Because are happiness and well-being the same thing? You can only figure that out if you define them both. And we've already established that well-being can be defined and conceptualized in lots of different ways, and the definition of happiness has changed over time. So it's a really complicated question. But here's another interesting overlap for you. We know that things like having meaning and purpose are considered to be part of eudaimonic types of well-being. Okay? But this research on this slide has shown that people who have a greater sense of purpose, in other words, people who have a greater sense of meaning in life, which is part of this eudaimonic well-being, they end up earning and accumulating more money, okay, than people who have a lower sense of purpose or lower eudaimonic well-being. But, interestingly, if you just went out to achieve more money, that would not be considered good for or part of eudaimonic well-being. So that's just quite another interesting overlap, really, about what eudaimonic well-being really is and how it fits in with general well-being. So, time for a recap. Okay, we have gone through lots of different ways to conceptualize and define well-being. We've seen well-being as subjective well-being, which is one of the most common and most well-used definitions, concept, measure of well-being. Okay. You've also now got hopefully a grasp of what hedonic well-being and eudaimonic well-being kind of, how they might differ, what that means, because they are words that you're going to see in the literature when you do reading, but you're also aware that there's some overlap there and some kind of blurred lines. And you've seen these kind of other conceptualizations or definitions of well-being that are trying to address eudaimonia, either in part or in full, but you've seen how much overlap to the hedonic idea that they have. So, in sum, there's lots of different ways to define or conceptualize well-being. This presents quite an obvious issue with well-being research, okay? There is a lack of a clear definition of well-being. That means it can be hard to compare studies. If loads of studies get done that measure well-being in loads of different ways, you can't compare them. You can't look at the different impacts. You can't find out what is related to well-being. So that's quite a big issue. In other words, with so many definitions, it's hard to do what positive psychology set out to do. How can you measure and compare between people and cultures and nations if you can't decide what well-being is? So what's the point? Well, as a researcher, you can and should just pick one definition, measure it and use it. Or you can use a few and see how they differ and vary. All right? So, it is possible to investigate empirically, and finding out about levels of well-being is interesting for its own sake. Okay? But it's also useful to examine what factors might be related to its rise and fall, what impacts well-being and makes it vary. So you can look at that in terms of the world, a country, a city, a group of people, an individual, as long as you are consistent and clear with your measure and definition. Okay? So it really is a useful thing to do, and it means that we can see if we can improve well-being and what that improvement might do. So, empirically, there has been plenty of evidence that increased or high well-being is good for us. Okay, so there's just a few examples here. There's a lot more out there. But remember that to do this, to demonstrate these benefits, what we have to do is take a very specific definition or concept of well-being. So in all of these studies and more, they will be clear on, are they looking at positive feelings? Are they looking at life satisfaction? Are they looking at subjective well-being? Are they looking at flourishing? Okay, so the better the research and the more research there is that is more clear, the more the benefits of well-being and increased well-being become clear to us. Let's get more specific. So, in a way, it's common sense. Improved well-being should be obvious. It's an end unto itself. If you feel better, you feel better. But increased well-being, and this is well-being conceptualized in various ways, including things like positive emotions, does seem to have a really significant effect. It looks like it might help people live longer, recover from operations quicker, increase their sociability, increase their generosity, reduce hostility, increase their success. In particular, there's something called the broaden and build hypothesis. And what that says is that if you have positive emotions, or if increased positive emotions, they kind of then broaden some of your actions and behaviours to do other things. So increased positive emotions makes you more creative and more imaginative, helps you be more resilient, helps you persist longer at a task, makes you more optimistic, helps you pay more attention to information, and it can also help undo negative emotions. So, in other words, the benefits of increased well-being, whether that be through positive emotions or more broader definitions of well-being, they have clear benefits. One really simple example is the fact that if you improve someone's positive emotions by making them watch a funny video, they can hold their hand in a bucket of iced water for significantly longer than someone who either hasn't had their positive emotions improved or someone who you've made sad. And so this list on this slide is more of some of those kind of experiments where they've manipulated people's mood and seen the impact it can have. So in other words, well-being can be, or happiness, or positive emotions can be changed or improved in the short term, and then that has further impact in the long term. So, many of those benefits to individuals can therefore have an overall impact on the population. In other words, if you can have a positive impact or improve the well-being of individuals, you can expand that, and you can do the same for larger groups of people, and that kind of extrapolates out. Once you can do that, you can apply these benefits to specific areas where well-being might be most needed, or improved well-being might be most needed. So things like counselling, things like schools, things like helping people with addictions, things like workplaces. So all of this can then be applied, and you'll be seeing that again throughout the rest of this module. So, what do we know about well-being now? We know many definitions and concepts of well-being, and that can be summed up in the idea that well-being is multi-dimensional. All right, there's lots of different facets to well-being. It's not easy to define, and it has many different dimensions. It's up to you to decide whether this is the case. Is well-being the same as happiness? That's up to you to decide. It's complicated, but well-being and happiness are often used synonymously. How we define well-being and why we're interested in it will have a social historical context, okay? So our definitions will change over time, and we have a lot of definitions and concepts at the moment, but you've seen how it's moved from, ancient Egypt to ancient Greece, to looking at well-being just after the Second World War, to, don't forget we had the American War of Independence in there as well. So you've seen that kind of evolution and how concepts of well-being have been built upon. And this is a little sneaky thing for the future, what we do with the information and the research that we do about well-being might have political motivations, okay, and may have some moral and ethical underpinnings, and you'll be covering that in the critical lecture that you get in a few weeks. All right, so you've done loads now listening to me bang on. One final mini task if you want to do it. Don't spend too long on this, because actually this is a question that you could spend years on. Just have a quick reflect on the last few chunks of lecture. Are happiness and well-being the same thing? That's what I will leave you with. Any references from this lecture will be in your online reading list. Hopefully, if you can't find them, let me know. Okay, that's it. I will see some of you in the live seminar at the end of the week. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next week. Okay, bye.